Where do you find God? Almost sounds like a loaded question, doesn't it? I mean, if God was someone you could find, wouldn't everyone be out searching? Well, rather than looking for something elusive, like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, I reckon it's more about learning to recognise the way God is already present to us in our everyday lives. I'm Lizzie Oakes, and this is Where Do You Find God? My guest today is a longtime friend of Rhema Media. He's a minister, chaplain and broadcaster, Francis Ritchie, commonly known as Frank. Frank, welcome to Where Do You Find God?
It's a pleasure, Lizzie. Thanks for having me.
Hey, you and I haven't talked face-to-face for a little while, it feels like maybe a couple of years. And in that time, I know that you've been having a turbulent time and a lot been going on for you and your family. Can you give us a little bit of a snapshot of some of what's been going on for you?
Yeah, it's a good time to be asking me about that because I find myself, as we speak, in a really reflective space. And the main question you're going to ask me, I think, would probably have a different answer week to week because of being in that reflective space. And it's not just the last couple of years. I've realised that the last 4 years have had a big impact. I think about going into COVID and leading a church through COVID and being a relatively public Christian figure during COVID as well, and offering a way for Christians to be able to navigate that space. So there was the stress of those couple of years, and I've realised I didn't handle those years very well at all. And then 2022, I was involved in the fallout of a relatively big church on the national stage and being a part of that in some way. And then 2023, the year I thought, now this will be the relaxed year.
Yeah,
this is the year where I can breathe and decrease the stress a little. My daughter's health went on a massive descent, and we ended up having to take her to Germany effectively to save her life. And looking back over those 4 years, there are habits that were just survival mode for me. I've talked about online and on air in other places, I've talked about how I would stay up late at night and binge watch Netflix and snack because that was my alone time. And what I was trying to avoid through those 4 years was the next day coming with its stresses. And healthy habits that I had established before that, they just went out the window. So I'm in this phase of bringing those habits back and trying to rebuild health, physical health, mental, emotional, spiritual health, and reevaluating why I do those healthy things so that if stress hits again, they don't just go flying out the window. Yeah,
I was just thinking the irony of you finding lockdown hard. I found the first one hard too. But both of us, I think, being in a position where you're actually giving out and blessing other people, right? That kind of irony, right?
Yeah, and just having things always on. Like social media was such a big part of my communication at the time. And I remember first thing I'd get up and I'd walk into my office and I'd pull my phone out and I'd start looking at the news and comments that were happening on social media and thinking through how I could respond to them. And that would go on till late at night where I would eventually turn it off, go binge watch some Netflix and start snacking, which is an extremely unhealthy way to approach it. But I thought it's what I had to do. And there weren't any non-negotiables in my life that were healthier than that. So that's what I've been reevaluating.
Yeah. So Frank, in Acts chapter 17, verse 27, it says, God intended that they would seek him and perhaps reach out and find him, though he be not far. So my question for you is, Frank, where do you find God?
That's a very good question. And that verse comes from my favourite passage in the Bible. Paul in Acts 17 is my blueprint for how I do mission in the world and how I engage the world. So it's a great question. And my answer to that question, as I alluded to just before, would probably change from week to week. And in the last couple of days, I've found myself in what might sound like a reasonably paradoxical space when it comes to this, because I've been coming to terms with, where's God when things are truly silent? The void. When you feel like you're speaking into nothing and maybe he isn't there. And I've had to face that a little bit over the last 4 years and recently. And so And this is going to sound a little weird, because I know for some people, when they face the void and they face that silence and they feel like they're speaking into nothing, that then leads to maybe walking away, because it leads to the question of, is God really there? And if the answer feels like no, you end up walking somewhere else. But I'm finding this sense of intimacy in that space and a sense of leaning into a trust that I think has always been there, but I've never had it really tested. And now that there are times where it feels like it's being tested, I'm discovering that trust is there, and that then feels peaceful. So I'm leaning into passages like there's the man in Mark, I think it's Mark chapter 9, don't quote me on this, where a man brings his son who's demon-possessed to Jesus to try and have him healed. It's just after the image of the transfiguration. And Jesus gets a little frustrated with his disciples and some of the others standing around. And he tells this man, if you just believe, you can achieve anything pretty much. And the man says, I believe, help me in my unbelief. And I'm really enjoying that line at the moment. Or in Romans 8, where it talks about how the Spirit intercedes for us when we don't know what we ought to pray, and that groaning that goes on inside. And I've seen some ways that gets interpreted around speaking in tongues, but I think it's much deeper and richer than that. That when I don't know what to pray and I'm sitting there and I'm doubting and I've got questions and I'm wondering, there's this trust that the Spirit's doing it on my behalf. And then it talks about in that little bit, as God searches the heart, or he who searches the heart, he then finds the Spirit praying the will of God. So there's this trust in me now that when I'm sitting there and things feel silent and maybe there's a void there, that God and the Spirit are just kind of working in me somehow, that the Spirit's throwing out these prayers that God wants and God's picking them up. I find that really, really profound. But that can't happen if I know what I'm supposed to pray.
That's really beautiful and really profound. But what is it that, to get to that space, we often have to go through a whole lot of pain?
Yeah, that's terrible. I wish it was so much easier. If you could just sit there in silence, go, okay, I don't know what to pray, so the Spirit's doing it for me, as opposed to getting to that space by going through some really tough things. I remember sitting in churches in Germany and having nothing to pray, but because they're so old and so ornate, the churches I was sitting in, there'd be things that I could look at that would just draw my mind upward, would draw my mind towards heaven. So I was really thankful for all those who had been before me, who'd created those spaces as well. So there's something of God there. But I'm in a space that's a lot less sure, and I'm getting to the point where I kind of like it. I've been reading Mother Teresa, and she had these profound experiences where she heard from God to spark what it is that she ended up creating. But then if you read her letters, and there's a wonderful book where you can read most of her letters, if you read her letters, as soon as she started the work, she started feeling this darkness and this void. And that went on for most of the life of her ministry. And so she had to trust that as she encountered the poor, that Jesus was in the poor. So by not having those consolations where she felt like she was directly hearing the voice of God, she was forced to find God in the poor who she was serving, and in the trust of the mission, which I find phenomenal. That space where you get to where you go, actually, I don't have it all together. I don't know much of anything, but the Spirit's doing what the Spirit does.
There's something that you said there about being a lot less sure, but starting to like it. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this thing for a while now. I've been in broadcasting in some form or other from a Christian perspective for well over 20 years now. And when I think back to who I was very early in that journey, then, there was theological study. People would call me up in the talkback show that I used to do many years ago. They'd ask questions and I'd have some sort of answer. And I would still put thoughts and answers on the table if people ask me questions, but I think there'd be a lot less certainty behind some of those and a lot more trust, I would hope, in God. and hopefully a discovery of something deeper. I think when we have all the answers, or we feel very certain about everything, things can get a bit flat. And God is easy to box then. Whereas if I discover that there's not much of anything that I really know, God has to become so much bigger. And at that point where if you feel like you're speaking into a void, and you have to ask the question, am I going to trust or am I going to walk away? If you answer that with a sense of trust, that's going to take you into really interesting places as well.
Yeah. It sounds to me like this is a sense of being at the end of yourself in a way? Or would you call it something else?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if I've found what I would call it yet. I mean, I'm still going, so I don't know if I've found the end of myself. It's not like I've taken everything that I do, thrown it up in the air and go, I really can't do it anymore. But I think I came close. I think I came close to that. If anything, I think I've discovered my frailty in front of God. And the things that I do, there's a lot of adulation that comes through. There's a lot of hate that comes through. There are a lot of people who really hate who I am, hate what I do, and they completely disagree. But there's also a lot of praise and adulation about how good people think I am. And it's really easy to believe that sometimes. So to hit a time where actually I'm just reminded how frail that I am, and therefore how big and how good God is a healthy space to get to.
When you were talking earlier about being in this space that kind of feels empty, that kind of feels void, and God's not saying anything, this picture came to my mind. In fact, you and I connected on social media, and I know when you were in Germany, you were posting these photos of these beautiful churches and cathedrals and things that you went to. And they're so lovely, and I know, you love to go and sit in those places. But is it perhaps when for any of us like myself, when I've gone through struggles and you're going through a hard time, and it's that sense of when you sometimes is that friend that's just there with you and they don't say anything, but the fact that they're just there with you in it, that they're actually there and present to you. Could it be that that's what it's like for you and God right now?
To articulate it like that, I think you have to be aware of that presence. Not just trust that presence, but be aware of that presence. And I'd say I've gone through times recently where I haven't been aware of that presence, and then it steps into a trust. I think you've got to be in a place where you're able to take notice. So the other morning, I've just recommitted to sitting in silence for 15 minutes every morning, no matter what happens in that silence. It's a silence that's dedicated to sitting with God. And if my mind goes in 1,000,001 different directions and I get to the end of that 15 minutes and feels like it was useless, that's fine. But the other morning I was sitting there in that silence and my brain just started wandering all over the place, and I've got ways to bring it back. But I remember getting to the end of it, looking back and going, there was this moment where I just felt peaceful in there. And it might have only been for 5 or 10 seconds, but there was a peace there that was noticeable. And so in reflecting back on it, I wouldn't necessarily have said in that moment, I feel like God is present. But when I look back and I reflect on that 15 minutes, that 5 or 10 seconds turned into something really profound as I reflected on it and was able to go, I think God was sitting with me in that moment. So sometimes it's not necessarily in the moment, it's in the looking back, which is why St. Ignatius started this practice that we call the examen, where we look back on our day and we look for the consolations and the desolations, or the things where we feel like God was present and active, and the places where we feel like he wasn't. And often it's just in the looking back that you realize that God was there, which is why it's such an important discipline to look back.
Frank, thank you for joining me today on Where Do You Find God?
You're very welcome.
If you'd like to listen again, tune into Star each Wednesday morning at 10:30, or listen and subscribe via your favourite podcast app and give us a review so others can find us.